Shifting focus to coal then, which is another casualty of the conflict in West Asia, Indian portside prices of Indonesian origin thermal coal have risen to nearly 3-year high levels. This is driven by uncertainty surrounding Indonesian government policies and heightened geopolitical tensions between the US and Iran. The lack of clarity regarding export approvals from Indonesia, coupled with broader global concerns, has created a volatile market environment. Market participants indicated that sellers have adopted a cautious stance, with some withholding sales in anticipation of further price increases, while buyers remain hesitant to accept the elevated price levels. And to understand this better, we are now joined by Mrs. Nishtha Mukerjee Sinha, GMPIC at BigMint. Mrs. Sinha, thank you so much for taking your time out and joining us here on ET Now. And first up, we have to talk about the surge in coal prices and what the outlook is for coal prices going forward. With Indonesia now considering reducing coal production, how could this policy shift affect global coal supply and export availability, and what kind of impact is this likely to have on prices in the near term?
Thanks, Asesha. If we talk about, India's impact, what would be on the Indonesia's coal production cuts? Firstly, let's see what's happening in Indonesia. So Indonesia's coal production and exports have witnessed a drop in 2025. Production volumes fell roughly by 5.5% and exports were down by 6%. Interestingly, the drop that was marked last year was the first decline that we saw since 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic had disrupted the supply chains. Indonesia is considering to cut coal output in 2026, and the market participants estimate that the production drop could be to the extent of 25%. Indonesian Energy Ministry last year reverted to granting the RKAB approvals, which is the mandatory annual government approvals, compared with the 3-year approvals which were done previously, which has now been shifted to annual approvals. So many Indonesian miners have already planned for their equipment purchases and capital expenditures after receiving the 3-year RKB approvals, which were covered from 2024 to 2026. But the government's decision to reassess the 2026 approvals have forced the companies to revisit their production plans. Additionally, the weaker demand that we are seeing from China and India because of the increase in domestic coal production have contributed to overall drop in export volumes from Indonesia.
Right, so several factors continue to remain at play for global oil prices, and that is the reason we've seen a sharp increase. But if at all Indonesia was to go ahead and restrict its exports in the global market, do you think coal prices could further increase from the current levels, and how much could the increase be?
Yes, the price hike is primarily driven by the uncertainty surrounding the Indonesian government policies and the heightened geopolitical tensions from US and Iran, and the lack of clarity regarding the export approvals from Indonesia, coupled with global concerns, has created a volatile market, because of which prices of Indonesian portside coal have already risen to a 3-year high in India last week itself, and we are seeing further hikes this week as well. Near-term outlook in terms of prices looks bullish, and we can expect a hike because of increasing freight rates and limited cargo availability.
Nishtha, then what option do Indian buyers of coal have? Do you think they will go ahead and diversify their sources of buying oil, or could Indian players perhaps focus on more purchases from the domestic manufacturers itself, and that could reduce the volatility in oil prices, in coal prices that we are seeing globally?
Yeah. Although Indonesia has remained India's largest supplier of non-coking coal throughout 2025, while Indonesia, did mark a reduction in the overall imports to India, the factor being that increase in domestic coal production that we saw last year, where we saw 1% YOY increase in India's overall coal production. And if we talk about the second reason, so it is that India's power generation that we saw through coal dropped 3% on YOY basis because of extended monsoons and prolonged monsoons. So alongside the growth in renewables that we saw also was the reason behind drop in imports. Going forward, if we saw further drop in imports from Indonesia, then yes, domestic thermal coal would be a shifting option, a quicker one for the Indian players.
Okay, so Indian players would perhaps shift to domestic coal manufacturers, and that could be the way out to get rid of the volatility that we are seeing in the coal prices in the global market. But Nishtha, also wanted your thoughts on freight costs, which have seen a sudden spike over the last few days. What kind of impact is that having on coal availability and coal pricing in the global market? Is that a factor which continues to weigh heavy?
Yes, very correctly mentioned that dry bulk coal vessel freight rates have extended their strong gains since end Feb, and freight rates have risen by about 50 to 60% since then. And these were supported by elevated bunker prices and broader macroeconomic uncertainties that we are seeing currently. Additionally, Brent crude oil futures have also increased from $72 levels that were seen in end Feb to $92 levels that we saw yesterday. So overall, this has impacted the imported coal prices in India. And yes, market participants are indicating that sellers and buyers both have adopted a very cautious stance with withholding sales in anticipation of further price increase on the sellers end, while buyers are hesitant to accept the elevated price levels. So that's the kind of scenario that we are seeing currently.
All right. And can you give us some numbers and quantify the amount of coal India imports from Indonesia and the production of coal that we have in the domestic market? Do we have enough capacity and enough production in the domestic market to rely on that if Indian buyers don't want to get involved in the entire geopolitical drama and its impact on coal prices?
India imports roughly 160 to 170 million tons of thermal coal annually, out of which 100 million ton generally comes from Indonesia. So that is the kind of import volumes in thermal coal and Indonesia's share. If we talk about domestic coal production, overall it is over 1 billion ton, and that marked an increase of 1% on YOY basis in CY25.
Right, so we clearly rely heavily on Indonesia for import of coal, but perhaps that could reduce going forward as we start increasing our focus on domestic manufacturing. Nishtha, thank you so much for taking your time out and joining us here on ET Now and helping us understand the surge in coal prices and what is really leading to that. But shifting focus to some other national and global stories then, crude oil tanker carrying Saudi Arabian crude